So this is the third video on the from classical to medieval topic, and this one I'm going to be talking about the post-Roman Germanic kingdoms. Just a little bit, kind of setting them up, what they were, how they emerged, some of their different characteristics and that kind of thing. And this will lead us into what will probably be the last video talking about the emergence of Islam and the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay, so when things sort of finally ended for Rome, right? There are different points you can give as like the end. The classical one is 476, because 476 was when there was no longer somebody who was called Emperor of Rome who ruled in Italy. Okay, the last such person was, people usually call him Romulus Augustulus, and he was a descendant of Theodosius, and he was deposed by a fellow named of Odoacer. Okay, so Odoacer was a Gothic general who had come in with a different group of Goths, not the Visigoths. The Visigoths were now set up in Spain and the south of France. Odoacer had been kind of acting as more or less Romulus Augustulus's chief general. And one of the things about this whole period, like the last few decades of the Roman Empire and into the next period, right, was that there was this big sort of overlap between the Roman army and the various barbarian groups. Okay, we already saw that a little bit in the last video when we talked about how Alaric had wanted to like work with the Roman army and like become sort of like no part of the Roman nobility. Sort of he wanted inside of the system, and a lot of Germans and Germanic speaking people got into the system one way or another. I mean, one of the things that had gone back in the Roman army for centuries was using what they called foederati or auxilia, which were allied troops that fought alongside the Roman legions, but kind of like under their own sort of command, right? Using their own weapons, or at least, so if you go back further, they're a bit more integrated. At least sort of in units that were made up of people who are sort of all from the same tribe, right? So they kind of joined together, okay? And this was a kind of a sort of tribute that Rome often extracted from its neighbors, or from groups that wanted to enter the empire. Was they'd be like, okay, you can enter the empire and we'll give you some land, but the price for that, not land as a separate kingdom, by the way, but just, you know, some land where you can separated land, like where some of you can set up households, is that some number of your young men are going to join our army as federates, and so the young men would go off and, you know, be soldiers, and the rest of the people would settle down and become Romans over time. But as things got worse and worse, auxilia became more and more just like, it's just like another army that's kind of like their own thing, and they're our allies for now. And that's what Alaric actually acted as. So Alaric really did, with his Goths, go off and fight the Suebi and the Alans in Spain and beat them, basically, right? So I mean, in a way, he was helping out the Romans. He was being a good ally, but at the same time, he had his own agenda in mind. And as Roman power fell further, right, you can't really be allies with somebody who isn't there, right? So the Visigoths just kind of ended up their own kingdom, right? And so Odoacer and a lot of the previous sort of major generals, many of them were of Germanic background, right? They were partly rose up in the Roman military hierarchy because of their connections to allies that they could maybe bring in with them, right? Like, hey, yeah, make me general and I'll bring some troops with me, more or less. But Odoacer basically had been sort of trying to negotiate with the Eastern Roman Empire for some sort of like legitimacy for himself and his family, using his status as like, I'm the protector of Romulus Augustulus, and it wasn't working. And eventually he's like, okay, I'm not wasting my time with this guy anymore. I'm just going to call myself King of Italy, and that'll be that. And so that was in 476. And that's the most traditional date to say, okay, that's the end of the Roman Empire. I mean, it's in terms of the Roman Empire actually being kind of like an independent state that was sort of like, controlling some area under its traditional government, that would be more like the 450s, probably. But 476 is when things are pretty clearly like, there's no, Roman government anymore. There are different barbarian kings in the West. Well, I shouldn't say barbarian, Germanic, right? The Romans considered them to be barbarians. Okay, and so if you look at that map in 476, you can see how far things had really gone, right? So you've got the Vandals down in Africa, you've got the Visigoths in Spain, but some of the Suebi are left up in the top left-hand corner, right? You've got Burgundians, you've got some Stagrius guy, right? You've got Britain is a mess. You have all kinds of different groups, right? Alemanni and Franks, all kinds of different things, right? So these are mostly German-speaking Gothic type tribes that have themselves set up inside of the territory of what's now the former Roman Empire, right? And some of these groups are more Romanized, some of them are less Romanized, some of them are Christian, some of them are not, right? So basically, the groups that had previously been closer to the Roman borders typically were more Romanized and more likely to be converts. But one of the key sort of things here is that a lot of the new Gothic overlords, right, these new groups that had come into Roman territory and were setting themselves up as kings and nobles, were Christians, but they weren't Catholic Christians. Okay? They were a different group. What had happened was some of Constantine's successors, right, so members of his family who reigned after he died, had subscribed to a doctrine called Arianism. Constantine himself had declared Arianism to be a heresy, but it was a widely held view, and some of his children had gone back to it. But then the Roman imperial sort of family swung decisively back to what Constantine had said was orthodoxy, and that became known, in Europe as Catholicism. Catholic just basically means universal, right? So it's supposed to be kind of like the true faith. And the true faith, according to, the Orthodox bishops who were installed throughout the Roman Empire, right, was this doctrine about the divinity of God called Trinitarianism, which is still, it's like the standard Catholic doctrine, right? That there are three aspects to God. There's the Father, there's the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And they are different yet the same. They aren't three different gods. They're not three different things, right? They're one. But at the same time, they are three, right? They have three different kind of natures in a way. And it's really hard to say exactly what this relation is. But the sort of creed, if I'm not getting it totally wrong here, is just that they are one and they are three. These things are both true and not contradictory. And the not contradictory part often troubled people because it's not really clear how you can have something that's one and three. And it's, even if it can be true, it's not easy to explain how, right? And so this other doctrine, Arianism, without getting too much into the weeds of what it is, the basic idea is that Jesus is sort of secondary to God, right? God, in some sense, created Jesus, and the divinity of Jesus is dependent on, inferior to, kind of subordinate to God the Father, right? It's maybe a bit more it might seem more intuitive to people who aren't, sort of raised in Catholic doctrine, right? Because it's like, if Jesus is the Son, Son seems to sound like the Father came first, right? Like the Father created him in some sense, okay? But that's not the Trinitarian doctrine, that's the Arian doctrine, and there's some other heresies that are similar. So when we say heresy, by the way, what we mean is just that this was not the dominant faith in that historical time period. So orthodoxy just means correct belief, but from a historian's perspective, as opposed to a theologian's or a believer's perspective, the orthodox view is just kind of like the politically dominant view, or the view that is held by the majority of the population. So the reason why orthodoxy in the Western Roman Empire and then the subsequent period is Catholicism, is this Trinitarian doctrine, is just because it was spread out under those Theodosius and his successors, and it was held to by most of the Roman and Romanized population. Okay, so the thing that ended up sort of splitting the Germans from most of their subjects, one of them was this differing religion that, according to the majority of the population, their rulers were heretics. Okay? So Clovis, who I'm going to get into in just a second, one of his big acts is he starts out as non-Christian. He and his tribe are pagans, but he converts to Catholicism, which becomes a huge deal because the Catholicism of the Franks makes them sort of like allies of the Pope and the Church, and the Church as an institution becomes one of the most important. It's really the only surviving institution after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and so it's going to play an important role in subsequent discussion in this course and subsequent courses as well. Okay, so that's why the Arianism thing is important. In any case, this was a problem because during that period where some of the Roman emperors had been Arian, missionaries had been sent out from Rome, and that was the period where there was actually a lot of success at converting some of these Goths who lived across the border, who are not Roman citizens or inside of the Roman emperor, to the one true faith of Arian Christianity. Okay, there's a Gothic bishop called Ulfilas who produced this Bible that was in Gothic, and it was an Arian. I mean, most of this stuff is sort of around the interpretation of things, but he was himself Arian, and the Goths who sort of got the word via Ulfilas and his other missionaries got the Arian word. And so then, this was back in the sort of mid 4th century, and 100 years later, when these Goths are establishing themselves as kings over these different areas, right? So the Visigoths, Odoacer, they are Arian Christians, and that immediately leads to conflict with the local religious authorities, right? And one of the things that it's really important to recognize too, and this sort of debate over religion fits into this, right? These Germans, right, they were, tribes of 100,000, 200,000 people total, right? And the population of the Roman Western Empire was much more than that. So they were sort of they became aristocratic lords, but they didn't mostly just get rid of the old institutions, okay? They recognized that there was a lot of valuable things in Roman culture, in particular educated people who could read and write and count and do math and were doctors and scientists and things, right? They recognized, many of them, that there was some value to this, in particular tax collection, right? And so they tried to kind of integrate themselves into the old Roman institutions to some degree. And this is especially the case with one of the subsequent rulers named Theodoric, I think. Yes, Theodoric sounds right. That's the Goth. I always get him confused with Theodosius, who's the Roman emperor who fought the Goths. But Theodoric, who actually is the guy who kills and replaces Odoacer. He literally cuts Odoacer in half at a banquet that they're having to celebrate their alliance. So gets his reign off to a nice intimidating start, right? The story is that he literally, like with a single blow of his sword, cut the guy in half. So Theodoric set up a new kingdom where he, kind of tried to integrate Gothic institutions with the institutions of Germanic culture, right? And that it worked kind of for a while, but just in the longer run, what happened was all of the actual Roman institutions, except for the Catholic Church, fell apart, right? They didn't last. They couldn't last, and there were a lot of factors that probably contributed to this. You can't point out just one, but it's connected to the demographic collapse and economic collapse that we already talked about, right? The combination of warfare and then other stuff like famines and plagues and so forth. But I think a lot of it was warfare, like just armies running around all the time, sacking things and living off the land, caused the population to just decline and decline and decline. And going along with that, there was a collapse in education and in literacy. Okay, so one of the interesting things about Theodoric is that he is king while there lives one of the sort of last really significant intellectual figures of the classical world, if you want to call him classical, and that's Boethius. Boethius is a Roman aristocrat who is very educated and who writes and speaks Greek as well as Latin. Okay, so he plays various sort of political roles, and he's a member of Theodoric's court, right? So Theodoric's court is a mixture of Goths, right, full-on like German-speaking warriors, and Roman aristocrats, right, from traditional Roman culture. And Boethius is one of these second. And aside from the sort of governing and sort of administrative stuff that he does for Theodoric, he also has a kind of a academic and educational purpose. His goal is to translate a lot of the works of Greek philosophy into Latin, but he gets only just to the beginning of this, right? He translates, I think it's one work by Plato into Latin, and this becomes like the one work of Plato that the Western Europe has in the medieval period. This work by Boethius, I think it's the Theaetetus, and then he gets arrested by Theodoric under suspicion of participating in a plot. We think he probably didn't have anything to do with a plot. There was a plot, but Boethius probably wasn't a part of it. But he's imprisoned. While he's in prison, he actually writes a book, because he's in prison for like a year. The book is called The Consolation of Philosophy. And in that book, philosophy in person comes to Boethius and asks, "Hey, Boethius, why are you so upset that you're in prison? What's the matter with you? Why are you crying? You're being ridiculous." A real philosopher, and I thought you considered yourself to be a real philosopher, Boethius, would know that being in prison isn't bad. It's not bad at all. It makes no difference, right? People who worry about the wheel of fortune, people who worry about like being successful or having money or being famous, those people are putting their faith in things that are totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. What matters? Well, your wisdom and your virtue. In particular, your virtue, because you're Christian, right? You're Christian, aren't you, Boethius? I thought you were. Because I seem to recall that after you die, if you've been a good person, don't you go to heaven and then everything is like perfect for eternity, whereas if you've been bad, if you've been vicious, if you've been distracted from loving God, then you go to hell and you suffer. So what does it matter if you're like in a cell for like a few months? What does it matter if your head gets cut off? What matters is, do you go to heaven or hell? So you're not really thinking much like a philosopher, are you, Boethius? So I mean, I'm summarizing, obviously, right? It goes into more detail than that, but that's the gist of it, right? It's a kind of a Stoic / Christian meditation on fortune, right? And on what really matters and how to live a good life. And, it's just some more general philosophical, ethical stuff. And this was another really big hit in the medieval period, right? It was something that was widely read and copied by, the later Christian monks. And so Boethius became a very influential author. And the story ends happily because he is indeed executed and goes to heaven, I assume. But no, he's in prison for a while, and then Theodoric chops his head off, and he never writes anything after that, obviously. So that story, it kind of encapsulates really one of the big things that is going on in this period, which is the end of Roman culture and learning, and the transformation into this new world, right, where it is these warrior aristocrats who are probably not very educated at the top. And whereas Theodoric, did sort of project himself as like Roman in some sense, right? Some of the other Germanic leaders didn't. And the other kind of big, probably the most famous and perhaps important in some sense of these German kings in the period right after the fall of Rome is Clovis. So Clovis is a king of the Franks, and this map is set after his death, right? So his kingdom is divided up among his sons, and this is already after a bunch of his kingdom has been recaptured by his enemies, right? So at its height, Clovis's kingdom covers most of what's modern day France, right? So it would cover all of what's the Burgundian kingdom and a chunk of the Ostrogoth and Visigoth kingdom as well, right? Clovis was a very successful warrior, and killed a lot of enemies and unified a whole lot of territory under his dynasty. One of the things that's really important to understanding, though, the subsequent period of history in the West, is that there's no concept of the state the way that the Romans understood it, right? The Romans put this little acronym everywhere throughout their empire, SPQR, right? And I'm going to butcher the Latin, but the English version means the Senate and people of Rome, right? So the S is for Senatus, P is for like Populi, I guess, and then Q is quod Romani. I think it's Senatus Populi quod Romani, something like that. And the SPQR stands for basically the authority of the government. It stands for the res publica, the public thing, the state, right? And a big part of Roman thought was this sort of allegiance to this thing that transcends the individual, the state of Rome, right? Which the individuals just serve, okay? That was not part of how the Germanic tribes understood things, right? The way that the Germanic tribes understood things was there was a war leader, right? If he was a really big war leader, he might be a king, right? And the free men would swear allegiance to a war leader, and they would fight for him, and in return, he would reward them. And he would reward them with, like wine and women and gold and stuff. But once they started conquering Rome, he would reward them with land in return for their service. And land was a personal possession. So the lands of the king that he granted to his followers were his, and they would then be inherited by his children. And when someone dies, do they give all their stuff just to one kid? Well, not usually, right? Not unless the other kids have been like really mean or like, I don't know. Usually the idea is you try and divide it up fairly, and so that's the way that the Germans did things, right? It's like, well, here are the lands of the king, here are his surviving sons, right? Because women don't count the same. And so the lands are divided among the surviving sons. And so after the death of Clovis, you have Childebert and Theodoric and Clotaire, and they get the lands. And then the traditional thing that happens after that is that then the sons go to war with each other and kill each other off, and maybe you end up with just one territory again and a new king of all the Franks. But not always, right? And over time, what this system meant was that Frankish and just generally Germanic lands had a very strong tendency to fall into what we would typically call like something like anarchy, right? Like a whole lot of individual leaders, because just like the land has been divided among one generation after the next. And this centralizing tendency of fighting wars isn't always totally successful in any case. It's also not super centralizing because it like involves civil war all the time, right? And also like a lot of very shady like poisoning people and kidnapping and like plotty type stuff, right? Like what we know of the 300 years between Clovis and Charlemagne is like you could write soap opera sagas to the end of time just based on all of the dirty dealings and incestuous, murderous, like power-grubbing stuff that happens in this period, okay? And so the takeaway basically is that you get what, certainly the Renaissance people saw as being this like collapse of everything that was good and worthwhile about the classical world, right? Culture, gone. I mean, there's a new culture, but not one that they liked. And the problem with the new culture was that it was not really a very written culture, right? It was mostly oral, and most of the people were illiterate. So whatever it was to live in it, from the point of view of 600 years later, there was nothing there, right? It was just like the lamps went out, right? Hence the Dark Ages. And law, well, Germanic law is pretty basic. It involved a lot of fun things like like different prices for different types of crimes like weregild, and different interesting ways of deciding if someone was guilty, like trial by combat or trial by ordeal and that kind of thing. But early on, most of the law wasn't even written down. It was customary, and once it was written down, when you compare it to Roman law, it to later authors seemed very unsophisticated and dare I say barbaric. So law, philosophy, learning, population, wealth, all of these things kind of go away in the West, right? Political strength, right? Even sort of military strength, right? Because all of these kingdoms are individually much less impressive than the Roman Empire was, right? So it's sort of like a lesser fallen age from the point of view of later Renaissance authors, right? And I mean, as much as from our perspective, there's a lot to kind of be interested in and admire, it certainly wasn't peaceful. It certainly wasn't particularly comfortable. In some ways it was freer, so that's good, right? There's a lot less of sort of like outright reliance on massive numbers of slaves, right? There's a little bit more of a kind of a free peasantry in charge of their own thing going on. So that's maybe a step up. But I mean, in any case, like our goal really isn't to like evaluate better or worse so much here, right? That's something that the 19th century guys were interested in, not so much for us, right? But it is important to recognize why people sort of considered there to be a kind of this historical break here, right? Because in so many ways, life in the 6th century is so different than life in the early 4th century, right? In Gaul, in what had been Hispania, in Italy. right? It's just very different, right? Like travel, right? Under the Roman Empire, you could most of the time travel pretty much anywhere and not worry too much about like brigands or pirates, or like, there were excellent roads, there were like hotels here and there, there were like armies and patrols whose jobs were to keep you safe, right? There was a rule of law, right? If someone robbed you or something, there was going to be like, magistrates who might be interested possibly, and you could maybe like ask them to help you out. Like it was very, very different. Like none of that existed in 7th century Europe, right? It's just like, there are bandits all over the place. The roads are not maintained. There are guys, in heavy armor with warriors who consider themselves to be the government, but they aren't necessarily that interested in like solving your problems, right? They are mostly interested in trying to expand their holdings and win glory because they're like warrior dudes. There's there's almost nothing that we would call a government, right? There is they do sort of resolve disputes, right? But it's very, very, very different. Okay, so that's why the change was an important one, and why we are to some extent endorsing this like age thing of like there's this classical period and then there's this medieval period. Okay, so that is the Germanic kingdoms, and your textbook goes into more detail about that, so take a look there. But that'll wrap us up. I'll put up another video that'll talk about the rise of Islam and the emergence of the Caliphate, and that'll be next.